Okay, so now that we've looked at the concept of commodities, labor as a commodity, the division of labor, labor power, and surplus value. Now we're going to turn our attention to the sort of key concept that's existed or loomed rather, in the background of everything we've been talking about, and that is markets, right? Now, again, to put simply, a market is simply a medium through which different commodities are exchanged, right? And those commodities have to have an exchange value in order to make sense in a market. And often the expansion of markets and commodification go hand in hand, right? The further commodification requires the expansion of markets, and the expansion of markets requires further commodification. They're linked intrinsically under capitalism. Now, as most of us know, and probably understand, markets is probably something that I think most of you have a better understanding of than, say, commodities, right? Like, you probably had heard the term commodity, you have an understanding that commodity is something you buy, right? But you didn't necessarily understand the nitty-gritty of how a commodity functions, how it's defined under capitalism, the use value versus exchange value, right? Division of labor, obviously, maybe you didn't understand it in that sort of that technical sense, or how we define it under capitalism. But you understood, like, descriptively, division of labor sounds fairly straightforward. And markets is something that, again, you probably are familiar with. You understand the concept of, right? Anytime you've gone to purchase something, anytime that you've gone to a literal farmer's market, right? When you look at how a farmer's market operates, it's a bunch of people often selling very similar products, and you move around in that market to try to find the best deal, so to speak, right? So that's all a market is merely a medium through which different commodities are exchanged. Now, the key thing that we have to make, the key distinction that we have to make about markets, and this is central to understanding markets under capitalism versus markets generally. Now, again, as most of you have probably figured out and understand, markets have been around a long time, right? Markets have existed for pretty much as long as human civilization or society has existed, right? But just like when we looked at the emergence of, or the role of merchant capital in the emergence of capitalism and that transition from feudalism to capitalism, right? We looked at a society in feudalism where you had merchants, but very few people really interacted with merchants. The merchant capitalists and merchant capital existed on the margins of society. And then, of course, when we get the transition to capitalism, right, merchants took control of production. And again, I just want to keep emphasizing it. That is the key point in the emergence of capitalism, is once capital gets invested in production, in manufacturing. Prior to that, any form of capital was usually invested in trading enterprises, right? Which really is circulation. It's not production. You're investing in circulation. You're moving one good from one place to another, buy cheap, sell dear, kind of thing, right? Now, when you think of markets and the emergence of markets and the importance and centrality of markets to the capitalist mode of production, it's a kind of similar concept. And what we're going to look here is the difference between a society with markets and a market society, right? Capitalism is a market society, and I'll explain a little bit more exactly what that means in a minute. So, if we think of what a society with markets is, right, it's a kind of pre-capitalist society, right? Markets existed in ancient Rome, they existed in the Islamic empires, they existed in the Mongolian empires, they existed in China for the last 2,000-3,000 years. They even existed in early Mesopotamia when so-called civilization emerged out of the Fertile Crescent. It existed in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece. The point is, markets have been around forever. But those were not market societies in the same way that capitalism is. So if we look at the way I've got it organized here, right? In a society with markets, markets exist, though often on the margins of society, right? And that's the key difference. Just like how the merchant capitalist existed in feudalism, right? There were markets, but most people did not interact with a market before capitalism. And that's sort of key here. Markets then were mediated through pre-existing social relations, which is different than a market society. Or rather, markets were embedded within social relations. And we look here again, right? Under mature capitalism, the opposite is true. Social relations are mediated through the market, right? So under capitalism, it's not just that you have some markets here and there. Markets permeate all aspects of society. Social relations are always and everywhere mediated through the market. Social relations, in contrast to a society with markets, under a market society, social relations are embedded within the market. And we'll understand, or at least I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean. So this is the idea that Braverman gets, right? It says how capitalism is able to transform all of society into a gigantic marketplace, right? There's a perpetual expansion of the market. And you can sort of see this even if you watch the news. If you watch anything that relates to, business rated news, they're always talking about market expansion, right? Where are people looking for new markets? Where are markets expanding? Has the market contracted or is it expanded? Under capitalism, the logic of capitalism dictates, or the imperatives of capitalism, which operate as a logic and a rhythm, that markets have to constantly expand. Think about your Lynn, Massachusetts merchants who were selling shoes, right? What were they constantly doing? They were constantly looking for new markets and ways to expand the market, right? Because they would produce more shoes, more commodities, which meant more markets, or they would look for more markets, which meant they needed more commodities to produce more shoes, right? Now, what you have to understand is that it's uneven, right? We don't just go from a society where markets exist on the margins and then boom, all of a sudden you have a market society, right? For those of you that, especially that have taken history before, and hopefully for those of you that haven't, have been able to pick up in this course, that markets expand, but they expand unevenly, right? They don't just expand evenly from a middle until they take over the entire world. That's not how it works, right? And I'll explain a little bit how they expand. So they can expand in two distinct ways. The first way, which is probably the easiest to understand, is they expand spatially. So for example, as we saw in Lynn, Massachusetts, the early capitalists sought out new markets by traveling to different cities and different regions of the country, right? Initially they went to Boston to look for orders, and then they moved beyond Boston and were going to Philadelphia and New York, and eventually the South, they were selling their shoes to plantation owners, and then they were selling shoes to plantation owners so that they could outfit their slaves with shoes. So they were constantly looking for new markets, for new places to sell. Now, if you want to put it in a modern context, it could look something like this, right? Let's say you open up a restaurant or a cafe or coffee shop, right? And you open up one of them. And you realize, well, you can only sell to so many people with one cafe, right? Only so many people can come in and buy coffee. So you seek to expand spatially or geographically. So let's say you open up your cafe in, I don't know, Kensington Market, okay? And you realize that, okay, like there's only so much volume I can do in a day, so you want to expand. So you open up more cafes around Toronto to different neighborhoods, right? So you've expanded spatially, right? And then you realize, okay, well, I'm pretty good with the market in Toronto, so now I'm going to expand outside of Toronto to the GTA. When you've done that, then you're going to expand outside the GTA to Ontario. Then you're going to expand your stores all over Canada, and then eventually you go internationally. So what you're doing is you're looking for markets in a sort of spatial or geographic sense. And you can see how other companies do that, right? They're constantly looking for new places that they can sell their product. In that case, it was like franchising a cafe or coffee shop. But even, companies that are producing industrial products, right, are looking to sell. If you're a clothes manufacturer, you might look to sell beyond your initial market. Then eventually you become this sort of large manufacturer and are expanding and selling to different markets all over the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, especially in the United States, there was this obsession with the search for new markets, much of which led to U.S. imperial expansion in 1898 and 1900. But they were looking for new places to sell their product. And Americans at that time, the one place they were looking was China, right? Americans have been obsessed with the China market for over 100 years because they just, well, there's a lot of people there. Maybe we can sell our products there. It never quite worked out. But this is the idea. You can search for new markets by expanding your geographic footprint in where you sell. Now, the other way is to expand into different realms. Now, what I mean like this is, so for example, you get the expansion of a market into different things, right? So earlier we looked at how when you get the commodification of labor and time and the rationalization of production in a capitalist context, right? You have this demarcation between work time and leisure time. Well, leisure time now gets commodified, and as a result, the market can expand into something where there wasn't a market, right? So some of the things you can think of is entertainment, leisure. Things that were not commodified and exchanged in the market now become so. Think of anything you do for leisure exists in a market, right? Sport. Initially, if we take something like sports, which was initially this idea of leisure time, right? If you look at all the major sports today, right? Soccer, football being the world's most popular, right? It emerged where people had downtime when they wanted, entertainment, engage in competition, right? And that's sort of how it developed. It was amateur, but then somebody came along and said, well, what if I pay players to play one another, and then I sell tickets to have people watch those games, right? Now what you're doing is you're not just commodifying leisure and sport, right? But you're creating a new market for products. And then you can find new markets beyond that, right? So like, let's say, if you take the Toronto Raptors or basketball, okay, so now you've got, you've commodified a leisure activity. You're selling tickets for people to come watch two basketball teams play, right? But you can expand and create new markets by saying, well, wait a minute, what if we sold the t-shirts that they wear? What if we sold shoes with the Raptors logo on it? What if we sold basketball, right? All of a sudden, the commodification process expands with the market, and the market is expanding into different realms, right? Other forms of leisure, right? Amusement parks, leisure time that is now commodified and is creating a market, right? Entertainment, film, television, all of these things. But it gets even more so, right? When we think of how it expands into social relationships, and I hinted at this earlier, what we mean by a market society is how it permeates all aspects of society. So one of the things that's expanded to most recently is in many ways the most intimate form of leisure time, which is dating, right? I imagine most of you have been on dating apps, right? Things like Tinder, right? That is the market expanding and commodifying social relations, right? So now romantic relationships are commodified and they're entangled, and they now exist as a market. And think about what that does and how it reduces it to. Friends of mine that use it, right, say that constantly it's commodified the way we think about things. When you flip through a Tinder profile, right, it's almost like you're shopping. When you think about it, right, you swipe left or whatever, and you swipe and you see something and you keep going, no, yes, no, right? You're consuming. Dating has become, in many ways, a consumer commodity, right? This is what we mean by markets expanding to all aspects of society, right? And another way it can do it is to expand in things that previously didn't have a market, right? If we go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, in Canada, the United States, Western Europe, and other parts of the world, the state controlled a lot more aspects of the economy, which meant there were certain areas of the economy where there was not a market, where things were not commodified. And we'll talk more about this in the discussion tomorrow, but education is one, right? In certain respects, education does not exist in a free market. So for example, there's universal kindergarten, high school, right? There isn't a market for education in that sense, but then there's markets around it, right? So when you go to college in the United States, you may wealthy families hire tutors that cost thousands of dollars as consultants to get their child into a particular school, right? And this gets at this idea of the universal market, which is what Braverman is getting at. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And if you look at this, it's a quote in the readings that you did. The first step in the creation of the universal market is the conquest of all goods of production by the commodity form. The second step is the conquest of an increasing range of services and their conversion into commodities. And the third step is a product cycle, which invents new products and services, some of which become indispensable as the conditions of modern life change to destroy alternatives. In this way, the inhabitant of a capitalist society is enmeshed in a web made up of commodity goods and commodity services. This is what we're getting at with this idea of the universal market. And this is what we mean by a market society. In modern Canada or the United States and in most countries, there really is no escaping the market, right? Everything that we have is mediated through a market, even down to the most intimate forms of social relationships. And if you think of a company like Facebook as well, even in terms of friendships, right? What they are doing is commodifying your relationships, selling your data, right, to private companies to exploit it, right? Under Facebook, you are the product, right? You are not a customer, you are the product, right? So the market has penetrated the networks of people create in terms of their friends and social relations. So if we look at something like Facebook, it is very quite literal how the expansion of the market and how, if we go back to this slide, social relations are always and everywhere mediated through the market. Now that was true before Facebook, but if you look at something like Facebook, it really crystallizes it in a very concrete and literal way that your social relationships, even the ones that exist that are sort of real and authentic, are being exploited as a market relationship, right? Or the very relationships you have are being monetized by somebody else. And that's just sort of how to think of it, right? So the idea is that it's transforming all of society into a gigantic marketplace, right? It disrupts the course of social relations as we know it, right? Now, as I began this course, I talked about how capitalism is constantly and perpetually expanding, right? And that's true of the market, and it's true of the commodification process. And it's the key thing that Braverman seeks to emphasize here is that there is no end to the commodification process. There are many things now that are not commodified, things that you couldn't even imagine in the future either will be commodified as long as capitalism continues to expand, right? Or they'll create commodification in things that you couldn't think of, and the market will expand into those realms, right? So the expansion of the market has no end, and the commodification process has no end, and in theory, then the division of labor has no end. Markets are always expanding geographically and abstractly into other realms, and the division of labor is a process that is perpetually expanding and reorienting and reordering itself, right? And commodities are perpetually expanding. As the market expands into different areas, especially the service sector, right, there will always be this sort of downward trend of wages. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Don't forget to watch the two videos, the Charlie Chaplin video and the McDonald's video. All right, so that's it. See you guys tomorrow. And again, we have a week off, and then the midterm will be the week after that. And there is a video, of course, on the midterm. If you have any questions about the midterm, feel free to talk to me. Okay, that's it.